Welcome to HumanFuel, a podcast that explores the human art of thriving. Join two psychologists as they unpack the themes of well-being, effectiveness, and transformation for a more productive, fuller, and happier life.
Should we love our jobs? Who says so? Two friends, Sally and John, bump into each other. They have not seen each other for a long time. Sally says, "John, how's your job going?" John says, "It's okay, but I feel desperately unfulfilled. I feel stuck, like there's no room to grow." Sally says, "I have a friend who actually hates his job, but he is fulfilled regardless. He just makes sure that he loves the things he does outside of his work." This was a very simple exchange, but it captures John's imagination. What Sally has said has challenged a very deeply ingrained belief in John's mind, that one should love one's job, as if it were an unwritten law of the universe. But what if it's not? What then? Welcome to episode 3 of HumanFuel podcast. Today we are exploring the topic, should you love your job? Who says so? And why should you listen? I'm your host, Spencer, and I'm here with Joy. Hey, Joy.
Hey, Spencer, and it's good to be here.
Joy, here's the question. Should you love your job? What do you think?
Yo. The optimist in me wants to say yes, we should, or, well, I'd like to. I spend a lot of time in my work, doing my job, and I'd like to enjoy it while I'm at it. So why not?
Yeah. The truth is I haven't until very recently really questioned this. I just had an idea that, like you should love what you're doing. You are spending a good deal of your life doing it. And perhaps it's also just an idea that society drums into us, maybe not always overtly, but there's an undercurrent or like a belief that's passed down that we should love our jobs. But I've come to realize it's actually a very high bar. So, where did this idea come from? The answer is complex, but here are some things that I have no doubt have influenced the idea. Now, we are a proudly South African podcast, and it's always good to give local understandings of things or local ideas of things. This is a very European view, but I still believe that it has impacted how we see the world in Africa, in South Africa in particular. So the origins of loving your job. In 1905, Max Weber, a German sociologist, economist, and politician, wrote a book called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It argued that work has historically been tied to religious morality. Before the Protestant Reformation, work was often seen as a means to an end, something one did to survive. Wealth accumulation wasn't viewed as a virtue, and the Catholic Church encouraged almsgiving or charity as a way to balance out material success. However, when Protestantism emerged, particularly Calvinism, it introduced new ideas that dramatically shifted attitudes towards work, wealth, and personal responsibility. The religious shift, hard work as a moral duty. Calvin believed in predestination, the idea that God had already chosen who would be saved or damned. However, since no one could know if they were saved, they sought signs of divine favor. Hard work, discipline, and economic success became indirect proof of being among the elect. Unlike older views that saw work as just a necessity, Protestantism reframed it as a calling. One should work diligently, not just to survive, but because hard work was a spiritual duty. The economic shift, the birth of rational capitalism. Unlike the medieval elite who spent their wealth on extravagant feasts, clothing, and grand displays of power, Protestants saw luxury as sinful. This meant that rather than spending their money, they reinvested it, fueling capital accumulation and business expansion. Charity was discouraged. By not working, one was thought to be failing to glorify God. In contrast to traditional Catholic societies that placed heavy emphasis on charity and communal welfare, Protestant ethics emphasized individual responsibility. If you were poor, it was largely seen as a result of your own lack of discipline or hard work. This discouraged direct wealth redistribution and encouraged self-sufficiency, further entrenching capitalist individualism. The cultural shift, work for work's sake. Weber argued that Protestants worked incredibly hard, not necessarily for pleasure or for immediate wealth accumulation, which he considered rational behavior. Instead, they worked out of a deep moral obligation, which he considered irrational. Unlike earlier economic systems where people worked enough to sustain their families, Protestants worked beyond necessity. However, they weren't accumulating wealth for personal enjoyment. They saw wealth as a sign of moral superiority, but avoided spending it on personal indulgence. This was the perfect recipe for capitalism. The mindset created a cycle where wealth was continuously reinvested into businesses rather than spent. Over time, this reinvestment led to the development of large-scale capitalist enterprises, industrialization, and modern economic structures. Ultimately, the original religious meaning faded, but the work ethic remained deeply embedded in society. By the time capitalism had fully developed, hard work was no longer about God. It was about productivity, efficiency, and economic success. The idea that hard work is inherently good and necessarily remains central to modern work culture. Many workplaces expect employees to find personal meaning in their work, even when it benefits the employer more than the worker. So we need to talk about this. It benefits employers when employees love their jobs. It also makes the employee responsible for enjoying their work, which is a lot of pressure. Is it our responsibility to enjoy our job? What do you think, Joy?
Well, first, just reflecting on what I've just heard now, like at a very high level, I'm seeing the notions around work shifting with the shift in different societal sort of values and that sort of thing. And it kind of keeps moving back and forward between it being the selfless thing that you do because you love or for a higher sort of cause, or it's a place where you get paid economically and you get a sense of prestige in society. So how does that get in?
It's funny, I always heard of the Protestant work ethic growing up. I didn't really know what it meant, so it's actually quite interesting to read how it sort of came about.
When I think about just the research around this, I think it becomes a bit problematic if we put all of the responsibility on the employee of loving your job, because we are both, or if you and the system are both acknowledging that we're not just on an economic contract, there's also this almost psychological contract that involves these other things like love and attachment towards our work. Firstly, both must acknowledge that. And I think things start becoming problematic when, in some cases, we want to be warm and fuzzy and feel like a family and acknowledge the whole love aspect of what we're doing, versus times when things are hard and we let go of a lot of people, retrench people. So we cut them out of the family now, all of a sudden. And so where's the love then in that system, in that sort of job? So it's two very big ideas that I think will always be competing in my eye, especially when there isn't a truth of acknowledging where we are at from both ends of the employee and the employer, so that we acknowledge this agreement that is psychological, but is still an important thing to talk about and acknowledge from both sides.
Yeah. There's some amazing examples of employers doing incredible things for employees. I read one recently, and I must see if we can share it with the listeners, where a factory owner, it was in an impoverished area, that he made sure all the women working in his factory got educated, so they were able to make better lives for their families and the community at large. And it was quite a refreshing thing to read, because I think often employers just expect, it's very cheap and very easy to expect an employee to love their job. And the benefit is very one-sided. If the employer is not stepping out and helping that employee, it's very easy to say, well, you should love your job, because then the employee is going to exploit themselves in a sense. They're going to work harder than sometimes it's healthy to benefit that employer.
Are we also then saying that loving someone or something includes an element of exploitation? Can I love my job but still not allow it to be toxic?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I think
But
you
for
can.
sure, I can see the idea and the logic of one lending themselves more and bending over backwards towards their job because they love it. And obviously that means high productivity, high benefits and returns on a commercial front of things. But also, let's not undermine the value of you loving your job as well towards yourself, where it's not a strain of waking up in the morning. Perhaps when you love it, when we unpack why, maybe there's an element of it that's connected to your purpose. And that's why you love it, or someone at work that you work with that's connected to something bigger than just the job you're doing here. That's why you love going
Yeah.
to work. So, there can be benefits on both ends, I think. But for sure, when we look at it from the perspective of rands and cents, the organizations take the cut.
Yeah, I think you've raised some really good points there. And it's certainly a camp I would want to fall in. So I would want to be the guy saying, I love my job. Because, like you've said, there's a whole lot of benefit to the person. Perhaps it's where the message comes from that is important. So if that's coming from inside of you, that you've managed to, and you've been one of the people that are fortunate to align your life to work that is meaningful and enjoyable and purposeful for you, if you fall amongst that fortunate group, then that's amazing. But if the message is subtly being fed to you by the powers that be, the employer, well, then a lot of the time they're not really that interested in your fulfillment, I don't think. I think in those cases it serves a bit of a capitalist agenda. Anyway, so today it would be nice to kind of lay both sides of the coin, what I'm hoping to do. In 2014, Mayo Tokumitsu, hope I'm saying that name correctly, published a book called Do What You Love and Other Lies About Success and Happiness. Tokumitsu expands on a viral essay in the name of love and delves into how this ideology can lead to work exploitation and perpetuate systematic inequalities. Some key arguments are, number one, the do what you love philosophy often blurs the line between work and personal life, leading individuals to accept longer hours and lower pay under the guise of passion. This mindset can make it challenging for workers to recognize and protest unfair labor practices, as they're conditioned to believe that loving their work justifies personal sacrifices.
In fact, I remember when I did some research close to that, wasn't the love of work, but it was around the meaning of work. And it was amongst HIV/AIDS caregivers that go to different homes and provide care, supporting nurses and healthcare community centers. And when I'd ask questions related to why do you keep going to work even though it's so difficult and you guys are not resourced properly, etc., and it always leaned on this thing of passion towards work, of it being a calling, of it being, this deeply purposeful thing, that it does blur the lines between personal and professional. And to some degree, I remember taking a critical stance to that in saying, well, to what end, if it sometimes is also affecting their own well-being? Sometimes they take risks when you're working without gloves on somebody who's infected. Is that worth it? That love of your job, that seeing it as a calling while risking yourself, for example. So it really touches on very, I guess, case by case scenarios, showing that it's a very blurred line around personal and professional. But at the same time, when we look at all the work and research around life work integration from a wellness at work perspective, they are looking at prioritizing or situating what you do within a larger life frame. So if you want to enjoy your life and work falls as a part of it, depending on how you want to order it around, the two need to be integrated for you to be sort of well. So that also perpetuates a similar thing that can include a lot of exploitation.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
resonate with that a lot.
Yeah, healthcare workers are notoriously bad for pushing the limits of their time. I don't know if that's the right word that I'm using, but they tend to not stop. They don't know when to stop.
I'm just trying to be as practical and in their shoes as possible here.
And if you are under-resourced
Mm,
and there's not enough people working with you and you just feel like you've got to keep
You have
helping
to keep,
people.
exactly, because there's just this line of people needing help and support, and it's a life and death situation in a way. So, yeah, it's a difficult one.
Yeah. Okay, a second one of arguments. Pursuing a career based solely on passion is this one jumped out at me, Joy. Pursuing a career, especially in South Africa. I'll tell you why in a moment.
Yeah.
Pursuing a career based solely on passion is often a luxury afforded to those with financial stability. Tokumitsu highlights that the ability to choose such a path is a sign of social economic privilege, as not everyone has the means to follow their passion without considering financial implications. There's this meme, I just love it. It's one of my favorite memes. It's like this medieval picture, obviously taken from a painting or something. And it looks like a panel interviewing a guy, and they say, "Why do you want this job?" And he says, "I've always been passionate about not starving to death." And I always enjoyed it because I think there's a reality of that. I think there's a reality of that in South Africa, where people have to get jobs because they've got to eat, and they're not thinking about what they're passionate about. They can't get to that level of actualization because the social economic realities of their day-to-day life are such that they have to put food on the table for themselves or for their family. So that one jumped out at me. To me, in many cases, pursuing a passion is a luxury of people that have the financial means to pursue it.
Agreed. I think it's definitely the minority that sort of just kind of blow up doing their passion, and they get scouted, and then they become this, amazing thing and live this amazing life. I think that's not all of our parts, for sure. But I do think that I don't like the idea of work being tainted by the idea of our jobs. And we just had this conversation earlier, actually. Because sometimes when we look at our jobs in that context of, the organizational system, for example, it's connected to so many other things. For example, exploitation, other systemic things that happen there. And that might sometimes just kind of create this notion. I don't know if you've been on social media, but there's just this notion of just like not liking your job or working being something that just is something you get through so that you wait for the weekend. So that's like such a big hashtag, waiting for the weekend, hashtag thank God it's Friday type of trends. And I think they kind of taint this idea of working in general, because while yes, it's within the systemic thing, I think that we should look at it within that context and not let it overshadow the work that you can love to do too, outside of it being a job. Like our hobbies, that is work that we put into all of those hours, fine tuning and your voice, learning an instrument, learning how to bake, and all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's love you put into that. And I guess that's my only hope in us when we think about these trends going forward and our idea of love in our work.
Yeah, I like that broader definition of work. So, I mean, I've been using the word job. We've been talking about job, but I like the idea of work being a kind of broader, bigger thing. And your work can extend beyond your job, beyond your day-to-day job. Yeah. Okay, the third argument, or another one of our arguments, should I say, is that the do-what-you-love narrative tends to glorify certain professions, particularly white-collar and creative jobs, while overlooking or devaluing essential but less glamorous work. This creates a hierarchy where only specific types of work are deemed worthy of passion, marginalizing those in indispensable yet underappreciated roles. And then by internalizing the do-what-you-love work ethos, workers feel compelled to overextend themselves, believing that their personal worth is tied to their professional passion. This can lead to self-exploitation, where individuals push beyond healthy limits, compromising their well-being in the process. So we spoke a little bit about this just now. And that word is so interesting, self-exploitation. But the line that stands out to me is tying your worth to your professional passion. I can see how that can be problematic. Again, if we go to the level of job, maybe not talk about work, but let's talk about job. And you tie your worth to your job, I can see how that can be a problem. And actually, I think we spoke about this on an earlier episode.
Episode 1.
Yeah, that's right. So Kamitsu's work serves as a caution against uncritically embracing the do-what-you-love ideology. She advocates for a more balanced perspective that recognizes the value of all forms of labor and encourages fair compensation and working conditions, irrespective of the nature of the job. All right, then there's authors like Martin Seligman, who are deeply entrenched in my mind as being synonymous with happiness research. I was keenly interested in his work at university and in the years following. He's a founding figure of positive psychology, the godfather of happiness in my head. He wrote and released a book called Authentic Happiness, using the new positive psychology to realize your potential for lasting fulfillment. He argued that individuals can cultivate happiness by focusing on strengths and purpose. Seligman's work marks a paradigm shift from traditional psychology's focus on pathology to a more holistic approach that also considers what makes life worth living. I do appreciate that. There's definitely more here, but I'm not going to get into it. He isn't wrong, I don't think. But his critics argue that happiness research has been co-opted by organizations to shift responsibility onto employees. Again, coming back to the idea that if you're unhappy, it's your fault, not the workplace's. The literature produced on happiness, how much of it is used in an instrumentalist fashion to support the capitalist agenda? It was a long time ago, but I covered some of this in my master's thesis. Here's the title. Don't know if you're ready for this. A textual analysis of positive psychology's published empirical research on happiness, a critical theoretical approach using critical discourse analysis. It's a mouthful. And that was more than 10 years ago, so I don't remember a lot of what I wrote. Okay, the psychological perspective on the psychology. On this podcast, we're big on psychology. So here is some psychology. A good old-fashioned staple of industrial and organizational psychology literature, Self-Determination Theory by Ryan and Desai. They suggested that people are most satisfied when they have autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Intrinsic motivation, doing something for personal fulfillment, leads to deeper satisfaction, while extrinsic motivation, things like pay and promotions, can feel transactional. Daniel Pink wrote a famous book. Oh, I loved this book. It's called Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. Traditional carrot and stick motivation is not effective for tasks requiring creativity and problem solving. He identifies 3 drivers of intrinsic motivation. I always remember this as MAP, M-A-P, mastery, autonomy, and purpose. I didn't dig into this, but there's some clear overlap. And I can only assume that Desai and Ryan's research informed at least some of what Pink was writing about. Again, some truth that could be useful to us, but also makes us vulnerable to exploitation if we take a critical stance. Encouraging people to see their work as their identity ensures higher commitment with minimal extra cost. Here's the problem. Loving one's job can actually make burnout worse because emotionally invested workers push themselves beyond healthy limits. And I've seen some organizations that border on the cultish. When you look at their culture, I don't know if you've seen this, but I look at some organizations and I'm like, I don't know what it is that you're doing, but you're a cult. You just look like a cult from the outside. And the employees are just so bought into the culture, and it permeates every aspect of their lives.
Your family here. Yeah.
Yeah. And that scares me a little bit sometimes, I'll have to be honest.
It scares me a lot.
Yeah.
When a manager or leader starts saying that kind of stuff, it scares me a lot. Because I do agree that sometimes there is an element of just like micro manipulation there. Because you just keep planting these ideas in your speech and in what we say, we know the science behind all of that as well, and how that becomes
Mm.
framed in our minds. And as you said, it feels cultish a bit sometimes in organizations that have really like drilled down on it. It feels a bit uncomfortable. Like sometimes they even all like dress alike and they look alike, and you're like, oh my word, can we get a
Yeah.
diversity person up in here?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
when you actually want diversity, not only of race and gender, but just of like diversity of thoughts and expression
Exactly.
and all of those things. Because, it's one thing having a very strong culture, that's whatever you want to describe it. And I think what goes on, I think high performing is the term these days. But
Yeah.
I think it's so important to just acknowledge that, work is work, because this is an economic contract. And we
Yeah.
also need to acknowledge, as management sometimes, that that does kind of fall into our favor when employees love their jobs. But again, I just keep going back to my initial thoughts. Does love mean exploitation? And just going back to just the
Mm.
fundamentals of the terms.
Yeah, we haven't got to the takeaways, but that's almost like a takeaway for me already before the end of the episode. Does love mean exploitation?
Yeah.
Yeah. So finding the balance here, we've spoken about, I think, some arguments on both sides. Here's some middle ground to consider. You would do well to find work that is fulfilling and where you feel that you are intrinsically motivated, where you have some autonomy, can become competent, experience mastery, relatedness, and purpose. But let's take a step back for a moment and consider this from a philosophical stance.
Mm-hmm.
There's a British philosopher and writer named Alain de Botton. Shout out to my wife for introducing me to him. I like him. He co-founded something called the School of Life. There's tons of stuff on YouTube if anyone is interested. So his view is that modern society places an immense amount of pressure on people to find work that is not only financially rewarding, but is also deeply fulfilling. He criticizes the idea that everyone should love what they do, pointing out that this expectation can lead to unnecessary dissatisfaction and guilt when reality doesn't match up. And let's just be honest, most often it just doesn't. He explores how work shapes our identities and our self-worth, often suggesting that the modern world has created unrealistic expectations about job satisfaction. He acknowledges that while it is ideal to find meaning in work, it is also, and I like this, I really like this, it is also perfectly normal for a job to just be a means to an end, providing stability, security, and the ability to enjoy life outside of work. Ultimately, his perspective is that while fulfillment in work is possible, it is not guaranteed, and it's not necessary for a meaningful life. Instead, we should approach work with a more balanced and forgiving mindset, recognizing that it is just one part of a well-rounded life. I think you alluded to this earlier when you spoke about other aspects of your life. This is my personal view. I see all forms of work as good, provided that they do not contribute towards injustice or exploitation of others. I see work as a form of worship, as a form of service to God and others. And because it is worship and service, we should not make too little out of it. What we do in service to God, but neither should we make too much of it. Work itself is not God. So I don't believe we should love our jobs. It's okay if we don't, but I think it is a bonus if we do, and hopefully we can at least like our jobs.
I almost see it as a Maslow's hierarchy of needs type of thing, where work can be on like a y-axis going up there, where we do want to feel that work at the bottom serves our basic needs, of course, and work gives us the sense of stability and security. Level 2, and level 3 is around, what is it? I think feeling connected to other people and having relationships as well within that context and system. And then when you get to the top of self-actualization, while I'm not a big fan of Maslow, I love though how we first here are able to take in a concept where it's okay that we sometimes would never fully experience what it's like to be self-actualized. And let's put in this episode in our
Yeah.
work. for example. So it's a nice North Star to aim for, I think, and I'll always aim for that. As with all aspects of my life, I don't want any aspects to suck. But also, when we look at it from a longitudinal perspective, I am learning to give room, and it's only now, and I'm like, close to 40. Oh my goodness, that I'm learning the need to just also acknowledge that there will be phases of life that do suck, man, that you don't love, or aspects of work that you don't love. And it doesn't mean that will always be the case. So it's an interesting topic to reflect on right now, actually, just in my career and in my life. When I look at having just always loved my job, and yes, sometimes allowing it to abuse me a little bit, but always being conscious of it though, and getting to a point where when it's within the job is within a bigger system, it gets more and more complex, and it compromises my ability to fully show up in that space. So that obviously also takes away from me enjoying the job. So it's also just acknowledge, hey, I'm in this phase of my life right now, so I can be okay with a job that sucks. Or right now, I'm really trying to get out of I don't know, deep depression from something else. And I'd really love to be in an organization where I feel values me too. And I'm doing work that I really love to do. And that's also okay to want out of life. I don't want to be guilted out of wanting to love my job too. You know what I mean?
I do. I like what you said. You don't want any aspect of your life to suck.
Pretty much. That kind of summarized it.
I think so. The word that he used here was forgiving mindset. And that's quite a nice lens to apply.
Yeah.
That
you
can be a bit forgiving towards your circumstances at a particular point in time. And as with, I think, most things in life, just learning to ride the wave is important for longer term fulfillment. That means enjoying the moments that are a little bit more giving and just getting through the troughs.
Absolutely.
So enjoying the peaks, getting through the troughs.
I love that. And that breaks it down to something more manageable in saying, hey, some days will suck, but also just ride on the moments within your work that do feel so deeply fulfilling. So it's not just an all or nothing approach type of thing, which I like.
Yeah. Okay, so a few takeaways from today's episode. Number 1, from the Protestant worth ethic to published research on happiness, we are brainwashed into believing that we should love what we do. Remember, this is not a law of the universe. It's just what you've been told to believe. 2, there is value in finding stuff to do that is intrinsically motivating, or in Pink's language, where you can achieve mastery, gain some autonomy, and find purpose. Valuable but not essential. Life is more than your occupation, and sometimes fulfillment comes from other places. But I liked your concept, Joy, of having it as a North Star. So this is what I'm always going to aim for, whether I'm there right now or not. It's always going to be my aim.
Or even,
and then lastly,
Spencer, in percentages. I remember one time on a job that I really, really hated overall. And because I'm not a quitter, I kind of started looking at it in terms of percentages. I'm like, okay, so can I at least aim for 40% loving my job? And I'd literally try and find aspects that would give me that. And I'd always just check in with my coach. Where am I on the spectrum right now? So, and that was another thing that helped me to not have an all or nothing sort of approach to it. And in those times, you do learn that nothing is ever wasted in our actions and what we do. So there's so many things that I did, for example, that I absolutely detested. But at the same time, a year after, I'm like, oh my word, I'm so glad that I sat through these meetings. Now I understand what financial statements are. Now that I'm running my own sort of
Yeah.
business. So that's another way of taking a more longitudinal sort of approach to this thing, or a bits and pieces and not an all or nothing sort of approach to it as well. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Nothing's ever wasted. I like that. All right. And lastly, the modern workplace often creates unrealistic expectations about job satisfaction. But work, unless it does harm, is noble in and of itself, regardless of its content. And then just circling back to John that I mentioned in the beginning, he's much happier these days. He understands that sometimes work is fulfilling and sometimes it's not, but that it's noble nonetheless. And he's able to provide for his family. And there is, I think, a lot to be said for providing for your family.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
Or yourself,
Or yourself. Yes.
Extended
Or yourself.
family, as it being an economical means to an end. Absolutely. There's no shame in that.
Yeah.
There's no shame in that.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to HumanFuel podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode and got some value out of it. If you did, the best compliment that you can give us is to share the episode with a friend. You can also leave us a comment on YouTube or send us an email at humanfuelza@gmail.com. Your feedback helps us to create better content, so we would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.